I'm fighting a bit of a residual cold here, so hopefully I won't go into any coughing spasms during the talk. I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Dr. Aaron Rachitsky and Azwia Porter, who worked with me on this. I've got two messages here. The first one is that the salmon crisis is actually much worse and much broader than most people have recognized, which is not a good message. The other one is going to be tried out for the first time ever here with this group, and it's to urge some caution about how we go about doing freshwater habitat restoration. It's not enough, in my view, just to say that we're going to do this. We have to think much more carefully about the problem. I'm going to come into that and try to lead towards that. But the broader issue is that there's a big problem. It's not a problem in the Fraser River. It's not a problem in British Columbia. It's much bigger, and what I'd like you to keep in mind in the back of your mind as I'm talking is that knee-jerk reactions where we're going to fix one thing or the other is not going to be good enough, because many times they're based on a professional judgment, the way we've been trained, but that training may not have been fully sufficient, and I'm going to move into this. So there's four themes to this talk. The first is that there's been a widespread and massive decline in marine survival of salmon. I'm going to talk about the Chinook and Steelhead data because we've collected this, we haven't collected this, government agencies have collected this, but it also applies to coho and sockeye, certainly. This data, the data set extends for, we now have 3,055 years of survival estimates that we've collected. The Pacific Salmon Commission has provided the Chinook data under their Chinook Technical Committee, and that provides the SAR data on this. You'll hear me say SAR, which means smolt to adult recruitment, or the survival from the time the smolts are enumerated leaving the rivers to the time they come back. And we also have data for steelhead for a somewhat smaller geographic region that comes from Dr. Neela Kendall at Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, but includes a little bit of B.C. data as well. And a really important point that I'm going to elaborate on right now is that this region of very poor survival includes regions of pristine salmon habitat, so northern BC, southeast Alaska. Bear that in mind as we look at these declines in survival. Third point in the talk is that we have a problem that psychologists call the streetlight effect, which is that people want to focus on the things that they can see right in front of them, they know how to do something about, there's an immediacy and an ability to respond, but that may not be where the major problem is. It doesn't mean that there isn't issues to fix in fresh water, but in many of these cases, these are marine problems that need to be, in my long-standing view, dealt with directly, as well as issues in fresh water. And finally, the habitat issue. This is both a problem and an opportunity. And people recognize the opportunity, but they don't recognize some of the problems. So I'm going to spend some time talking about this. Okay, the current study that's out for review at the journal PLOS One is for Chinook and Steelhead, and it compares by geographic region the survival, smolt to adult return for this whole region that extends from southeast Alaska down through to the Snake River in Idaho and up the coast. And here's a zoomed in area for this region. The dots show the individual data time series that are available for this region. And here's the data. So I'm going to step through this fairly quickly. Sub-yearling or fall Chinook is on the top row. Yearling or spring Chinook is on the bottom row. And Steelhead is down here. And each of these panels is the data for one region. And it's the smolt to adult return as percentages from south to north, the Oregon coast, the Snake River, Upper Columbia, Mid-Columbia, Lower Columbia, Washington coast, Puget Sound, Strait of Georgia, West Coast Vancouver Island, which is Robertson Creek, North Central BC, and Alaska. And similarly for Steelhead, except this is the Keogh River up by Port Hardy on the northeast tip of Vancouver Island. This is Bruce Ward's data set that he generated through his long career with BC province. So each of these panels shows the same thing. It shows the survival for the region and the type of fish over time. And it runs from, the graphs show from 1960 forward. So I'm going to start with Snake River. Everybody knows the Snake River. 8 dams, the dams destroyed the salmon runs. So here it is for yearlings. This is the data sets. The red line, for those with a technical background, is a lowest curve through that data and shows that the survival was up around 4 to 6% in the 1960s. The Snake River dams were completed in the mid-70s. Survival dropped at that time and has remained low at about 1%. No problem. Everybody knows the general history of that. All right, this is the current survival level for Snake River fish drawn across all of the panels, so it's 1%. And you can see the fall Chinook, or sub-yearlings, also at about 1% here. And if we step this forwards, let's take a look for this audience at the west coast of Vancouver Island, fall Chinook, Robertson Creek. It started off back here in the 70s, 4 to 6%, a little higher. The black line shows the lowest curve, the local regression through the data, dropping down to 1%. And the red curve on each of these panels is, in the top row, is the Snake River sub-yearling data, means overplotted. Here's the Snake River yearling, or spring Chinook, overplotted on all these other regions. The big take-home message is that in the most recent years of the data, West Coast Vancouver Island has the same survival as the Snake River fish. If we look at the Strait of Georgia, the fall Chinook, again, have roughly the same survival. In fact, for this particular one, because of the Chilliwack hatchery not far from here, it shows a little bit higher. But if you exclude the Chilliwack, which has a much higher survival than any of the other regions, the survival here is half what it is in the Snake River. So one of my throwaway lines in the paper is that clearly this demonstrates that if we put 8 dams in the Fraser River, we'll double the Chinook returns. So since nobody would accept that, obviously there's a problem with our thinking, because if I'd shown you that this data said that it was 4% in the Fraser River and it was 1% in the Snake, we would immediately have jumped to the conclusion that it's the dams that cause the problem. But when the same data is put in the opposite way, we're much more skeptical about it. So, because it doesn't fit with our prior expectations. And this is true for a lot of the salmon work that's going on. Let's step through this a little bit more. Here's the Strait of Georgia, the stream-type Chinook, which is essentially Fraser River fish. Stream or spring Chinook here. It's down at about the same level. In fact, the survival is lower than it is for the Snake River fish. If we look at Alaska and northern central BC, you see that the same thing's happening. So these black trend lines, I'll zoom in on one in a minute, are going down as well. These are regions of essentially pristine freshwater habitat. Now, part of the message here is that in more southern regions, we are never going to be able to recover our freshwater habitats to the levels that we have in northern BC or southeast Alaska, because we just have too many conflicting competitions for the resource, the broader resource, including fresh water. And if we look at northern BC with the fall Chinook, this is the northern end of the range for fall Chinook life history type. Again, it's about the same as the Snake River. So the message here is that everywhere is down to the level of the Snake River. It really hasn't been recognized just how broad this is. Southeast Alaska is as far north as we actually have survival data, but we also know that in Yukon, Kuskokwim, and other major rivers in the rest of Alaska, adult returns are way down. We don't know what the survival is because they haven't measured the smolts out. But Alaska's dealing with a major problem with Chinook returns as well. And in talking to some of the ADF&G biologists, they think that they have a similar downturn for steelhead as well, but the data's more limited. So big message here is everybody's gone down flatline to the same level. It's at 1%. Global warming's in the background. In my view, this is somehow associated with the warming that's happening in the ocean, but we don't know how. And my caution here is that we may go down to 0.1%, which doesn't sound like a big difference, going from 1% to 0.1%, but that would be a reduction in the adult return of a factor of 10. So a small percentage difference, but a huge difference. We've already seen that with Saginaw sockeye, which I believe some people will be mentioning. The run is now functionally extinct. It's just holding on in a hatchery. This is the Keogh River data. The good news here is it's not down as bad, but it's gone down from 15 to 16% down to 4%, and in some of these years it was 1%. So at the north end of Vancouver Island, the survival is better than in the Snake River, which is over here, but it's still gone down by a great deal. And this, certainly in the Keogh case, we know that this is a marine problem because of just where the enumeration happens, just off the mouth of the river, within 300 meters. Okay, just to drive this home, here's the Southeast Alaska data. This is multiple river systems, and the data shows that the trend is down from about 4% down to about 1%. That's the Snake River in the background. So we're now down to the same level. So how does this fit with our, normal thinking about how things happen? If you read the scientific literature, most people don't even bother to cite that the dams cause the problem. They just say the dams are one of the major problems. I'm not just here to say that dams do not kill fish. What I'm here to say is that the primary drivers are very different because Alaska and northern BC are down to the same levels. So I'm going to skip through most of the science slides in the paper, but I'm going to do this one just to drive home what the relative magnitude is. So again, what we've done is we've taken the fall or sub-yearling Chinook stocks here and the yearling or spring stocks here. We've now broken it into 4 time periods. Prior to 1977, these are times that we know of major regime shifts in the ocean and associated declines in survival decline. So prior to 1977, 78 to 1998, 1990 to 98, and then after 1999. Now what we've done here is in each year, we've taken the Snake River survivals that we've got for these life history types, and we divide that into the individual survival estimates for all of these other areas. So that means the Snake River becomes 1. So down here, we have the Snake River, and by definition, it is 1 on this ratio because we're now looking at the ratio of the survivals in these regions and how it's declined over time. So the snake becomes 1, which is the red line here, and we're now going to compare these regions broken up by time periods. So we'll start with prior to 1977 for Alaska, just as an example. It's at almost 19 times higher survival, but it's based on 1 year of data. It goes down in the next period to about 3 times better survival. In the period after that, again, it's about 3 times. And then in the most recent period, it's about 2 times. But I showed you from that prior graph that it's 2 times on average, but it's declined. There was a steady decline. So the most recent years is 1. The earlier years was somewhat higher. So this is just averaging all of the data in the post-1998 period. It says it was twice as good, but in fact, in the most recent years that the data is available, it's no better. We'll step through a few more just to make this point gruesomely obvious. West Coast Vancouver Island, the Robertson Creek, was about 60 times better. Goes down to about 12 times better, and it's the same. Within the accuracy of the data, there's no difference. It's at the same level. If we look in the most recent period, post-1998, essentially everything is at the Snake River level. If we step through and look at it for the spring Chinook, again, we see the same thing. There's a little bit of a difference here, a couple of them where it's slightly different, and we get into the paper in terms of why this is happening. But the take-home message is that we don't have a better situation in these systems that do not go through the 8 Snake River and Columbia River main stem dams. These are the official data sets that were submitted to the Pacific Salmon Treaty for Pacific Salmon Commission, under the terms of the treaty. It's the official government data that all of these agencies have been submitting. Now, one of the interesting take-home messages is, as you look at this, is that as things have gotten worse, people have tried harder and harder. So this is the sampling effort. It's the number of years of data available each year for a river, one or more rivers. And you can see, and it's just scaled versus the year of smolt emigration. And you can see that as this is the Columbia River data sets, the other regions along the coast, and this is all. And this drop-off here is just because I think the data series are incomplete. They haven't been submitted at the same time by all these agencies. So as the crisis has worsened, more and more sampling has gone on to verify that the problem is really bad. But it actually hasn't translated into better insight in what's happened, or recognition that survival is about the same level up and down the coast. So, summary so far. As marine survival has worsened, government agencies have redoubled their efforts to count harder, hoping that maybe the problem won't be there in some of these other river systems that they're now sampling. More widespread monitoring has not translated into addressing the marine survival problem. It's something I'm not going to talk about here, but in fact, in the paper we show several case studies where even though it was completely clear to the agencies involved after years of work that it was a marine survival problem, they turned around and went back and started finding new things to do in freshwater because they knew how to do. And this is what psychologists call the streetlight effect of looking here under a lamppost for your keys because the light's better there. It's not going to deal with the problem if this is the overriding problem. Governments and NGOs have responded to increasing efforts to protect and improve freshwater habitats because it's something that they do know how to do. Their agencies are built to addressing this. It's the way we as biologists were trained in our undergraduate years. And what I'm going to show you now is that these efforts may not be successful for reasons that people have not recognized. So, stock recruitment curves. I'm going to be talking mostly about what's called the Beverton and Holt curve. The basic principle is pretty straightforward. You know, the number of spawning parents, the eggs are fry. As this goes up, in the absence of what's called density dependence, you would just get more recruits back. If there's density dependence, it saturates and you get diminishing returns. What I want to show, the Beverton and Holt curve was developed by Ray Beverton and Sidney Holt in 1954. Canada's Bill Ricker developed another curve which fortunately does not appear to apply to salmon populations at almost the same time. And despite the fact that they've been out for 65 years, what I'm going to say is that I don't think anybody has actually recognized why this has such a serious implication for freshwater habitat restoration. The stock recruitment relationship, the positive first, is it's the one property that has prevented these populations from collapsing under these decreases in survival, marine survival. Under climate change, this has provided stability, and I'm going to explain why. But the basic point is that as marine survival has dropped, the recruitment has stayed high because of the freshwater processes that are playing out here. Unfortunately, it also is going to create unrecognized limits in our abilities to do freshwater habitat restoration. I'm going to spend the rest of the talk outlining this. First, I'm going to demonstrate that density dependence and stock recruitment relationships are reasonable to look at. Here's a paper for Snake River Chinook. In each of these cases, you can see at very low densities, very low abundances, recruitment goes up, but then it flattens out. Fraser Sockeye, this is Quesnel Lake, one of our biggest lakes. Shuswap Lake, again, at very low abundances, recruitment goes up, but then it flattens out. Lots of scatter around it. This is, for those that aren't familiar, this is the Ricker curve. This is the Beverton and Holt curve. I'm going to be using the Beverton and Holt curve to illustrate the problems, but the problem that I'm going to outline is even worse if Ricker dynamics actually held. Interior Fraser Steelhead, This is a steelhead. When I was Googling on Google Images, I asked for a young buck steelhead, and I got this picture, which those in the front may actually recognize one of our speakers that's going to come up in an earlier phase of his career. That's Bob Hooton, if the figure's too small for people to see, back when he had hair. So this is the Thompson River aggregate. Some of the subsections or tributaries. This is the aggregate. This is the response in terms of brood year spawning stock size. Where we're at right now is at 177 fish, according to the most recent estimates that I'm familiar with. We don't know if this curve matches this. It's just outside the range of the data. It's not until the adult brood comes back, or recruitment comes back from this brood of 177, that we'll know whether the curve bears any relationship to reality. So density dependence is ubiquitous. In the Columbia River Basin, strong density dependence is now evident for at least 25 of 27 spring Chinook populations, the Snake River Fall Chinook, and all 20 steelhead populations. So let's take it that it exists and it's important. Here's why it's saved our bacon so far. Forgive the mixing of metaphors. Here's the Beaverton-Holt curve. And let's say that we start off with a fairly high population, lots of eggs or fry in this river system, and then marine survival comes along and drops survival. Well, as poor marine survival pushes down the recruitment, the number of adults coming back drops to a lower level, and we shift from this sort of abundance of spawning population to this sort of abundance. But the benefit is that there's almost no reduced recruitment because we're up in the flat top of the curve. So when marine survival falls far enough, we can suddenly drop off that flat part of the curve, and any further decrease in marine survival will cause recruitment to drop catastrophically and very, very quickly because we're down very close to the end. So that's an extinction vortex. We just get too close to the cliff and then we basically get sucked over. That seems to have happened for Saginaw-like sockeye, which are now declared functionally extinct. And I strongly believe that many other populations are very near this point, such as interior Fraser steelhead. And the real take-home message here is that the next period of really poor marine survival is going to take many, many more populations off that same cliff. So here's the extinction vortex for Thompson River fish. This is the data that we know. At some point, we fall off the edge of the cliff, but we don't know where that cliff is. So there's an important property that has not been recognized, and this is something that's going to affect the ability to just do effective freshwater habitat restoration that's going to improve the prospects for these populations. So far as I know, this is a genuinely new idea. I came up with this because I was looking for a way to better entrain the freshwater aspects of the work, where lots of money and effort has been put, to focus that as well as get more focus on the marine survival issue. And so far as I know, it's not been identified nor factored into salmon management efforts. It's going to be the subject of a paper that we're working on right now. For those of you with some background here, if you do know of somebody that has actually laid this out before, please tell me and we'll give them credit for it in the paper that we're doing. The key point is that we need to identify when these density-dependent processes happen during the freshwater phase. And stream restorations obviously become a major focus. Some of the most recent estimates are calculating that the total cost of annual restoration efforts in the lower US 48 states are now over $1 billion a year. So back to our friend, the Beaverton and Holt curve. We're now down because of very poor marine survival to a low initial spawning stock number. Well, let's say we decide to push that up. The recruitment is here. It's still staying reasonably high because of the density dependence, but we've got a low adult return, so there's no fishing because we've basically backed off on fishing to not push us any farther down this slope here. Well, if we now go to a major enhancement activity, and we boost up the number of fry or the number of eggs, so spawning channels, cleaning the gravel to boost survival of the eggs, or hatcheries releasing fry into the river system. With a great deal of effort, we can push up the abundance, but we make very, very little difference in the enhanced recruitment that comes out of it, simply because these density-dependent processes are taking it out. There's a bottleneck in there if the density dependence happens after the freshwater interventions that you're trying to do. So we make a big effort and we get little return. We can change that, but it requires doing the freshwater interventions after the density-dependent processes are going on. So when do they occur? Well, the salmon, and the message here is that the salmon life cycle is many habitats. So within the river, there are multiple life history periods. The fry come out, they go into side tributaries often in the winter to overwinter before going out to sea. So there's not just one freshwater habitat in here, there's multiple ones. And of course, there's lots of marine habitats. We just don't know what those marine habitats are. These animals probably, and this is something for a different time, probably pass through 8 to 10 distinct marine habitats over their marine phase. Any one of those, or more of them, could be the problem for the poor marine survival. But if the ocean is the major problem, the question is, can we make enough modifications to freshwater to really make a positive difference? And are we even approaching the problem in the right way? Are we approaching the right habitat in freshwater to make a correction for these density-dependent processes? And the answer is, we don't really know, or I certainly don't know. Reviewing the literature, habitat restoration efforts taken before the freshwater period will be ineffective for the same reason those processes are compensating for the poor marine survival so far. My review of the literature so far is that we have never really carefully examined this, and it's obviously a critical issue for freshwater habitat biologists to take on. Unfortunately, what we do seem to see is that density dependence that causes this regulation is occurring late in the freshwater life history. There's not a lot of information on this that I can find, as I say. Here's a quote from a 1988 paper. For coho, there's been a growing realization of the critical role that the winter period plays in determining freshwater production of juvenile salmonids. Bradford suggests coho salmon abundance is limited by spatial habitat, but the hints are that it's during that last winter these animals move off into side channels, narrow areas where they overwinter. And of course, these are territory holding animals. So steelhead, coho, Chinook, all the young fish hold territories, and the marginal fish get pushed out of the prime territories, and they may not be surviving, and that may be causing this density dependence. So Nielsen and Taylor, Rick Nielsen's going to be talking about this, but it's not enough to just say we have to fix habitat. A quote from their paper is that bycatch mortality in commercial salmon fisheries and declines in marine and freshwater habitat quality are the key factors driving the declines in interior Fraser steelhead. I take some issue with this because it's a common quote. I certainly am not criticizing John Nielsen and Rick Taylor for quoting this. This can be found through the literature. Brian Riddle with the Pacific Salmon Foundation funded us to go up in 2016 and put some acoustic instrumentation in the Chilcotin River. I took these photographs as we were driving in to put the equipment. You know, this is a pristine river. The Thompson River certainly has lots of development on it, but the Chilcotin is actually the Chilcotin steelhead is actually in worse condition than the Thompson River, and yet the habitat is pristine. You know, we are never going to achieve freshwater habitat values like this for most of the rest of North America where there's people around. It's gorgeous territory, with the exception of the deer ticks that we had to keep pulling off ourselves. But it's still got major problems. This is a population that I think is down to 57 adults, is it, Rick? Yeah, so The Thompson has 177. So it's worse, but it's got clearly less impact on the habitat. So the summary. The current salmon crisis is worse than you thought it was. It's far more widespread than people have recognized. The usual suspects are not the main problem here. And the reason I can say that is because both Southeast Alaska and Northern BC have smolt to adult survival returns now down to the same level as the Snake River. Now, there's a geographic difference in when this happened, which I think is associated with expansion of poor coastal ocean conditions up the coast. But as we say in the paper, we don't know what happened in the marine phase because the Bering Sea stocks, the Yukon, Kuskokwim, Cook Inlet, which is near Anchorage on the south side of the Alaska Peninsula, they all have major problems, but they do not come back off the west coast of North America. So I would be shocked if they're out there. So something's happening that's driving a much broader aspect. We're not, as scientists, we have failed you in terms of being able to tell you what's driven this, why it's as big as it is. Fortunately, what has compensated for our incompetencies in actually understanding what's happened at sea is that the density-dependent processes in freshwater have compensated for that. So as the marine survival has dropped by almost an order of magnitude, a factor of 10, the compensation in freshwater has benefited the adult returns because it's maintained them at a much higher level than they would be otherwise. We wouldn't have the fisheries that remain if this density-dependent regulation doesn't happen. Unfortunately, we must be really close to the point of rapid extinction for many of these populations. We need, in fresh water, to understand when the density dependence occurs if we're going to be successful in trying to provide some more buffer. But to really address these issues is going to require different strategies. Simply doing more of what we're already doing isn't going to work because so far I would maintain that it hasn't worked. We have documented better and better, with more and more rivers being sampled for poor survival. We're documenting farther and farther just how bad the problem is and extensive, but it hasn't really led to any insight as to what's happening. So, conclusions. Widespread declines in marine survival are occurring. I'll leave it to the paper for those who want to see it. This is a marine problem. It is not a freshwater problem because of the nature. It's just far too large for it to be largely driven by freshwater effects. The usual suspects that we would blame: dams, freshwater habitat degradation, fish farms, forestry, you name it, cannot be the primary cause because it's over a far too wide an area. The sort of industrial processes or anthropogenic processes that play out in certain areas, you can point to them. In British Columbia, we point to fish farms and say, it must be fish farms that cause this. Well, it's easy to make that one-to-one association, but as soon as you see that it's occurring in these other areas, then these local regional effects, they may play a role, but they can't play a major role. So on the freshwater side, understanding where and when in the freshwater life history this density dependence is playing out is going to be critical to better informing how we try to do freshwater habitat restoration. As a former, now 20-year in the past DFO employee, I can say that the management response has not been encouraging, and I can categorize it as dysfunctional, but that was the reason I left 20 years ago. So some things haven't really changed. People want to do something. They say, we have a problem, we'll do even more of what we know how to do. That has not been very successful to this date. The message for you with the selective fishing is that we really need selective fishing in there as part of this mix because it will buy some more time on this. But agencies, as we all know, are very slow at responding. It's going to take a lot of pressure. The other side of this is there is a tendency to only address easy targets. That's called the streetlight effect. It's well established in the psychological literature. The joke I used to say 20 years ago was it was the drunk looking for his keys under the streetlight, and somebody says, keys aren't here, why are you looking here? And he said, oh, I lost them over there. But the joke, of course, is that he's looking there because the light's good. You know where the problem is, but trying to do something different that's easy isn't going to necessarily be successful. And we need to fix this. We need to improve both how public funds are used and to identify and address these very real threats. I'll leave it with that. Actually, I do want to mention this. I don't think the Ricker dynamics are coming into play in salmon populations, even though that was where Bill Ricker originally intended them to apply. But if the Ricker dynamics are in there, in fact, it's worse than Beaverton and Holt because, by reducing, increasing freshwater habitat or abundances in certain stages, you could actually reduce recruitment instead of just leave it as marginal effects. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Yeah. So, questions?
From both there's piles of money being lined up right now to put into habitat restoration from both the provincial and federal government. How do you think they should go about spending it?
Well, I just told you how I think they should not go about spending it. The wild salmon policy that the province put in place had a period of open comment. I spent 3 days sort of crafting what I thought was a balanced suggestion on why some of these things need to be addressed, about habitat, for example. I haven't had a response back for it. I think it's public consultation, but it's going to take a lot to change, the bandwagon. The problem, from my perspective, I started off in dealing with marine survival issues in DFO in 1990 when I started the High Seas Salmon Program. And, the anecdotal point was back then people would say, well, we can never, even if you could figure out what's happening out there, it'll never change what we do in freshwater because, we can't change the ocean. And I would say, well, if you don't know what the problem is, how can you make that, conclusion? And people would just shrug and say, well, we're going to do things in freshwater because we know how to do it, and that's the way all of us have been trained. So I get that. Unfortunately, this is like many other areas, getting surgeons to wash their hands prior to an operation. That was a 100-year effort to get people to actually do something as simple as washing their hands. It killed a lot of people. It's a public policy issue. It also involves people within agencies that are, they've got lots of challenges, but one of the challenges is actually getting them to change the way they do things. We need to do that. What I'm suggesting to you, and the reason that I've put this in this presentation, habitat is something that's ingrained in all of us as conservationists. You protect the habitat. My message is that it's got to be more nuanced. Which habitat is the problem? Where are these density-dependent processes? I think that's a new contribution. We need to think that through and then say, okay, where are these processes occurring? Does it make sense just to put more spawning channels in? Does it make sense to just add more gravel or do these sorts of things? So. Rick?
I agree with 98% of what you said. But I think it's important to have a clarification that there are many, 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 many other reasons for restoring freshwater habitat that have nothing to do with salmon. So the point is, but many people do justify habitat restoration for salmon, which I think is essentially your point. But as I say, there are many other reasons for restoring freshwater habitat other than just salmon. So I don't think that it's necessarily correct to say that we need to totally rethink the way we're allocating funds for sort of aquatic restoration. That's an important point to clarify. My question, I'll let you comment on that. My question is, can you offer, so the Steelhead and the Keel River were sort of the outlier, which is always the interesting thing. So is there something about their migration pattern in the ocean that seems to examine?
We don't know. There's a paper by Hart and Dell in 1966 that suggests steelhead goes straight offshore because all steelhead because they could not distinguish in 1966. I don't even know that I really believe that paper that steelhead goes strictly offshore. The other species do not, of salmon. They stay on the shelf for very long periods of time, all the way up to the Aleutians. This is actually some work that I was just writing up when I left DFO, and it's my fault I've never published this. But until December, the other species of salmon stay strictly on the shelf all the way to the Aleutians, including B.C. The suggestion from Hart and Dell is that the steelhead goes straight offshore. So, well, that's this way for you guys. They go off the continental shelf quickly. The Keogh River is up at Port Hardy, the very northeast tip of Vancouver Island. We did some acoustic tagging with Bruce Ward back in the day. We did detect one of these smolts out off Brooks Peninsula when we had instrumentation out there. So we have one Keogh steelhead that went around the north end of Vancouver Island and was detected on the outside coast. What exactly happens, we don't know. But if the Strait of Georgia is part of the problem, or southern regions, it's not just the Strait of Georgia, because the Washington outer coast has the same issue, they would be getting out of an area of poor marine survival sooner because they don't have to transit the Strait of Georgia as well. Is that enough to explain it? Probably. Is that what's happening? We do not know, and it's not enough to just wave my hands up here and say, well, here's something that is consistent with my beliefs. We do have the technology to do this, I've been saying for 20 years, but we really need to do this, because otherwise we go forwards on our beliefs as to what we think is happening, and that's not a good way to be doing public policy. Sir?
Clarification, I don't think I need that. I need either. Clarification on your spring fish, number one, being, are you referring to the stream type Chinook or just a spring run? And second to that, habitat restoration here. Restoring freshwater habitat, what we call, what some people call habitat is trees and all that. We're going to go plant riparian, but I think one of the key things we can do for the habitat for all of these fish is going to take a challenge to the province for the Right to Farm Act, and we're going to have to do something about irrigation going on 24/7 through the summer when the streams are hot. I don't say to stop the farmers from irrigating, but they don't need to be spraying 24/7. The water temperature needs to come down.
Okay, so let me break that into two. So the first one is, technically the way we broke it out in the paper is yearlings versus sub-yearlings. And the reason is that some of the hatcheries play a real Johnny Appleseed role, and they will take spring yearling Chinook and they'll release them as fry into the river. So they're presumably staying in the river for a year after that. Other ones, for sub-yearlings, fall Chinook, they're holding them until they're yearlings in the hope that they'll get better survival. Now, what are those animals doing? And what's the actual underlying genetics? We looked at this and we just threw up our hands in the end and said, we can't sort this out. We have to go back to every hatchery, and the hatcheries may not actually know which animals they're using, because all the spring fish come in the spring, the fall fish come in the fall, but for all we know, they grabbed a spring female and a fall adult out of the river and spawned them together. We don't know. So, this is just the realities of what's happened with the hatchery programs over time. Your comment about rising temperatures is a good one, but remember, again, if the density dependence is happening after that, it's possible that it won't make any difference, because it may be the winter habitat just prior to the smolts going out. I am not saying that it is the winter habitat just prior to the smolts going out. The data or the literature suggests to me that is a significant bottleneck. But that's not the same thing as knowing. But if it is, you can make those sort of statements about, protecting reserving more water to try to keep the temperatures up. But even if it was effective, it may not have that influence on the numbers that are coming out of those streams. And that's my message. I'm not disagreeing with you that it's possible, but what I'm raising is a warning flag that it's easy to say those things. It's going to be a lot harder for us to figure out where the density dependence happens and if you're correct or not. Fair enough?
Do you think we're overstocking?
Yes. So, do you want elaboration on that, or shall I? Yeah, so an interesting, have we got time for, I hope an interesting anecdote? West Coast Vancouver Island coho, in Haida Gwaii coho. Back 20 years ago when I was going to sea on the Ricker, we were sampling up in northern Alaska near Prince William Sound, for those who remember where that is, as far up in the Gulf of Alaska as you can. The juveniles are all on the shelf. They're migrating north and then west. And we picked up a coated wire-tagged Robertson Creek coho in this case. And so we got the data back and I went, oh, that's a long way from home. And then I calculated, contacted the hatchery. When was it released? It was a 3-day period. When did we catch it? It was August. How fast did it have to get, swim to get where it went? And it was 2 body lengths a second, 24 hours a day for 2.5 months to get there. So it was moving. We've subsequently done acoustic tagging. We've did 1 year of Robertson Creek coho, and we got fish up in Alaska. Again, they were going at 2 body lengths a second. Now, my grand sample of 2 fish fits with my pre-expectation, because if you look at the coded wire tag data for coho for Haida Gwaii and for the west coast of Vancouver Island, the only place those fish are ever caught in fisheries is those areas, nowhere anywhere else. But when you talk to the hatchery people, they say, oh, well, they're actually only caught right off the river mouth. Not even up the west side of Vancouver Island, but just off the river mouth, Barkley Sound and so on, or Haida Gwaii. Well, what I think is happening is those animals, and they come out of a particular glacial refugia at the end of the last ice age, they have a unique life history migratory type. It's the same, which is they go up the coast, around, get to the Aleutian Islands, at some point go offshore, and they're truly offshore coho. Most coho, as you know, stay on the shelf local. But based on my sample of 2 that get very far north very quickly, and the fact that the coded wire tag fish come back and are basically the fishery catchers are right off the mouths of those rivers, I think they come straight in from the offshore and therefore get caught just off the mouths of the rivers because their navigation's good enough that they basically just get caught there and nowhere else. Same life history type in Haida Gwaii and the west coast of Vancouver Island, completely different distribution of the catches because they have the same behavior, but they're coming in from the offshore. How much that applies to other coho stocks in the province or more broadly, I don't know. But we certainly have offshore coho. We have offshore Chinook. We have essentially all of the sockeye and steelhead are offshore for their whole life so far as we know until they come back in as maturing fish.
Getting into some discussion about what's going on in the marine survival. I mean, your earlier paper about if CO2 went to 540, that thermally the fish were going to run out of energy, and so we've got that. The question that Paul mentioned there about Asian ocean ranching that's reached open ocean capacity, whether we've now got ocean acidification or it's changed by 0.1 pH units. I mean, have you got any idea what's causing this, this sort of universal marine regime shift that we first saw in the late 90s?
Well, it's all of the above. We cannot dissect this out and say it's 80% this and 12% that. I mean, it's all of the above. But the issue that's going to come up repeatedly is we're getting into more and more crisis. The DFO has shut down the southern Chinook fishery because it's saving the fish for the killer whales. right? Well, is this the problem for killer whales? Because killer whales in northern Vancouver Island, southeast Alaska are doing fine, but we've just demonstrated that the Chinook problems are the same there, right? People are grasping at straws because they don't have a clear understanding of what's happened. So, being an opportunist, the problem for politicians is they don't go out, they cannot go out, roll up their pant legs and, fix the problem. They can demonstrate their good faith by putting money to bear on a crisis. We're in a crisis, but it's not enough to just throw money at the problem if we're going to be successful. And long term, unless we deal with the increases in greenhouse gases, which, obviously nobody's being very successful with, it's going to get worse. And as it gets worse, we get into more and more crises. We're going to, something must be done. So, we'll shut off, fishing for Chinook. We'll do this in Saginaw Lake at one point. There were proposals that they put sewer lines in for the cottages around Saginaw Lake. We should do something. These are extremely expensive things to do. But second, the worst thing is that we lose there's an opportunity cost. When we go and do A, as a knee-jerk reaction, that shuts off the avenues to do B, C, or D, which might be more sensible, because as soon as people start saying, we're doing A, they're not going to focus on, from an agency perspective, a government perspective, they're not going to entertain B, C, or D anymore. So this is the time to really think these things through, to try to have these, sensible arguments, but keep the avenues open, because if we make the wrong policy choices, what happens is the mechanism of government grinds forwards, but it may be almost impossible to then divert onto a different approach that may have been more correct.
Well, it would seem that we can't change ocean pH and ocean temperature in the short term, but the only thing that would be doable from a big adaptive management experiment is reduce the number of smolts that are going out to the open ocean from the Asian side. And some of the big hatchery outputs.
I did not say that I think it's the Asian fish that are causing the problem. I think that we're pumping more and more smolts out on our side to try to respond to this, but it's not clear that it's going to be effective. I think we have to look at our side of the house before we accuse this or blame this on the Asian production. First off, you're not going to be successful because their marine survival seems to be pretty good. So they're not going to be changing anytime soon. Second, there may really be issues with our hatcheries that we have not addressed. Marine survival is down. Growth rates of most of these populations are down. It appears to be growth rates during the return migration inshore along the coast. If that's the case, Asian salmon are not causing that decrease in growth. It's just hitting the literature now. I've got some work on this that showed sockeye that it was the last year of life that their growth was dropping off, for the last 20, 25 years. That's during the inshore migration phase now. Could be off Haida Gwaii as well. But, we need to look at those things. We need to look at it, from a broader, more open-minded perspective than we have.